damning documents released by the government have revealed that 7 out of 10 disabled pensioners are going to lose their winter fuel payments this year.
This really is a story that carries on giving, isn't it? This comes after Rachel Reeves' decision to scrap the scheme to help plug what Labour say is that £22 billion black hole.
Alongside over 1 million disabled pensioners who will miss out, nearly 5 million of those affected by the Chancellor's decision currently live alone.
And this is where we are, isn't it? We are now joined by the editor of Spiked, Tom Slater, to explain how can this story get any worse? Tom, good morning to you. Thank you very much for joining us. In a story that just horrifies me personally and many, many of our viewers on a daily basis, this just seems to be getting worse. What's the latest line on this one?
Well, as you've already been talking about, these numbers, this response, this freedom of information request have really just put in stark relief what the human cost of this decision, this removal of winter fuel payments is. You've talked about the 7 out of 10 disabled pensioners who will move out. There's also going to be about 2.7 million people aged 80 and above who are going to lose out as a consequence of this. And I think it's just a reminder that whilst for many years there's been this kind of caricature of older citizens, that a lot of them actually have done pretty well, that many of them are sitting on a lot of property, that many of them have done quite well out of life and out of the economy in recent years. In contrast to younger generations, a lot of them are still in very difficult positions, whether they're disabled, whether they don't have much in the way of income, and policies like that are beating up on precisely those people. And whilst the government wants to try and make a virtue out of making tough decisions, I think they're confusing tough decisions with bad decisions, and numbers like this really demonstrate that.
I wonder if, I mean, they're clearly under a lot of pressure. And at the moment, Keir Starmer is sort of digging his heels in. He's saying, you know, I told you that there would be difficulties ahead, and this is one of them. I just wonder if there may be any wriggle room that they might be able to respond in any way to this outrage from most people.
Well, that's what is the really difficult thing here, because part of the reason why they wouldn't try and implement some kind of more sophisticated means testing, looking at how much income pensioners have and trying to work it out on that basis, is because that's actually very expensive. And that's part of the reason why these kind of more crude measures are sometimes favoured. But at the same time, they do have choices. I mean, if you think about the amount of money that they're trying to save here, 1.4 billion a year. Last year, the government spent 1.8 billion on climate aid around the world. I mean, I think many people in this country, I'd say the vast majority, would think that things like that would be the first thing you would trim before going after pensioners who are not in a position to take out a second job, particularly if they're disabled, in order to get themselves through the winter. So governing is about choice, governing is about making choices. I think people are just being confronted by the fact that the Labour Party are making a hell of a lot of bad choices at the moment.
Tom, what they've said is over 1 million pensioners will continue to receive the winter fuel payment, never mind the 9 million that won't. And through our commitment to protect the triple lock, those on the full state pension will receive an extra £400 in the new year. But, I mean, that doesn't sort of like get around the fiscal drag that more pensioners will be paying more tax now. They're overlooking that, aren't they?
No, absolutely. And I think they're overlooking it because in the same way that maybe sometimes the Conservative Party were tempted to ignore some of the issues confronting young people because they didn't tend to vote for them, I think exactly the same is true of Labour. Pensioners were one of the few age groups to remain very firmly in the Conservative column at the last election. And also, I think there's been this general myth, as we've been talking about, that the older generation, they're barely ever on dry land for all the saga cruises they're on, that all of them have done fantastically well out of life. That's just not simply true. We've made a lot of progress on pensioner poverty in recent years, but it's still a very difficult problem, and policies like this are only going to exacerbate it.
Yeah, and it's interesting you saying that that they're not terribly worried about pensioners because pensioners traditionally don't vote Labour so much. But I'm the mother of young boys. I was going to say young men, and their generation, where the generation that is trying still to think of buying a house one day, a generation that is thinking of getting married. They all sat back this weekend and said, "We'll never have a pension, will we, Mum? There will be no pension by the time we need one. How are we going to cope?" So actually, everybody's worried about this, and everybody's got an auntie or uncle or a grandma and a grandma who may be living on their own and worried about the cold weather this winter.
No, absolutely, and rightly so. I mean, this is another one of the headlines that have really troubled Labour this week, is that their own assessment of cutting this policy back in 2017 would have suggested that 4,000 pensioners would have been at risk of serious illness or death as a consequence of this. And you're absolutely right, Anne. This is something that touches across society because we're not atomised individuals in our own respective generations. You know, we all have families, we all have grandparents, and this is something which I think for a lot of maybe younger voters is a reminder that there's been this kind of caricature of the Tories evil, the Labour Party will come in and they'll just sort out everything. They really are as bad as each other on a lot of these issues. They just tend to prioritise some issues and some concerns over others, as is often the case.
And that's such an important, just quickly, Tom, we're running out of time, just such an important point that Anne just made, though, about single people. You know, pensioners who have lost their other half, you know, and are facing this double whammy. And then there's a threat hanging over them of the council tax and the single person allowance being taken away. Again, that's going to disproportionately affect older people.
No, absolutely. And the fact remains that every winter there is always going to be that concern with cold homes leading to people, you know, dying early, frankly. And this is for that to go completely by the wayside in this discussion, just in the midst of talking about plugging the black hole, I think is really quite striking and shameful in many ways.
And also, they never mentioned this in the campaigning pre-election. They never mentioned this. Makes you wonder what they're going to come up with next, doesn't it?
No, completely. And I think many people are looking at the Labour Party in a new light as a consequence of all this.
Very much so.
Lovely to see you so early in the morning. Thanks for
Tom.
joining us. Thank you. Yeah, they forget, don't they, that everybody knows somebody who's probably going to be affected by this.
Well, this is, I mean, your lads are right. I mean, by the time people their age get to retire, you're not going to retire.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, they moan. I know, and they look upon me as the boomer generation, don't they? We had it all.
We are boomers.
Yeah, but and they say not only, you know, we're never going to be able to afford our own home, are we, Mum? And we're never going to have a pension, are we? So what are we going to do?
Well, they said by the time they get there, it'll probably be 70. And how many people are physically able to carry on working beyond 70?
Well, that's it. They were saying that we're going to have to work till we're 80 at least, aren't we? And I said, well, that's why you've got to keep fit. But honestly, it's the state of the world. We're not the only country suffering in this way. But suddenly, after 14 years of Tory rule and just sort of blaming everything on them, the tides have turned.
I just hope things could only get better, to paraphrase what someone once said for the Labour Party. But, you know, that things can only get worse. It does seem to be happening sooner rather than later.
Let us know what you think. The Russian President, Vladimir Putin, has issued an ominous warning to the UK and other NATO countries over suggestions that Ukraine may be given permission to strike Russia with Western-made long-range missiles.
He's said if that was to happen, then it would put NATO countries at war with Russia and significantly change the nature of the Ukraine conflict.
Well, that would be the point, wouldn't it? Significantly changing the nature. Anyway, despite all this, Sir Keir Starmer has pressed on with trying to persuade President Biden to let Ukraine access to the missiles. This all came during a bilateral meeting in the US yesterday.
GB News political correspondent Catherine Forster has the latest from Washington.
I don't think much about Putin. Those were the words of the outgoing US President Joe Biden as the press were briefly let into the Blue Room in the White House, where Sir Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister, and President Biden were meeting to discuss all of these very pressing global challenges. Ukraine, of course, top of the list. That comment in response to the very clear threat that the Russian president has made to the West if they allow Storm Shadow missiles to be fired into Russia. We haven't had an announcement on that. We weren't expecting it. It's quite possible that if it happens, we won't know about it until the weapons actually drop into Russia. Whether that will happen or not is still not clear. America has been very loath to agree this for fears of what escalation could do. But of course, last week we had the news that Iran is supplying ballistic missiles to Russia, and also we had that joint trip when the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy and the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken both going to Kyiv, and Volodymyr Zelensky saying again that he needs those weapons and he needs them now. A very delicate situation, and of course we don't know what's going to happen here come November, because we might have the return of Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, and then going forward, the situation could change again.
But Sir Keir Starmer has said it's down to Putin to end the war in Ukraine. Here's what he had to say after yesterday's meeting.
Only one reason we're having these discussions, and that is because Putin has illegally invaded Ukraine. The quickest way to resolve this, obviously, lies through what Putin actually does, because it's for him to end this. But we are having the discussion. We've stood with Ukraine. Ukraine has a right to self-defence. And we've stood united, not just with our allies here in the US, but across with our NATO allies. That's very, very important to us. But today was about having the chance to talk not just about a particular step or tactic, but the strategy in relation to Ukraine. But also we cover the Middle East in some extensive detail and other areas across the world. So it was a really important occasion for us to have this chance to discuss with our allies. We've got another chance week after next in Unger, and we'll take that as well.
Lots of words there. To explain them, thankfully, is former British Army spokesperson Major Mike Shearer. Mike, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Good morning to you very early. Mike, have we achieved anything by going out there and having these meetings?
Well, I think it's the natural rhythm of politics that has to happen. But delaying in any way in holding back our Ukrainian neighbours is simply wrong. They are fighting a war for their sovereignty, for their freedom, and actually not just for themselves, but really for the rest of Western Europe.
I was going to point out that the Times front page there, the lead, is Zelensky, Putin burns our cities as the West delays. He's beginning to lose patience with us, but can't afford to, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, the President Zelensky, I feel his frustration, and he is right. I mean, these red lines that we're all so excited about, let's not forget that we've already given them fast jets, F-16s, main battle tanks, new anti-tank weapons. So that was a red line, which has not been acted upon by Putin. I don't want to tease Putin's will, but we must help the people in the right here, and that is Ukraine with their freedoms and their sovereignty.
Mike, I'm very confused. Are the UK and the USA actually singing from the same hymn sheet on this? Because from what I could work out, Joe Biden is resisting pressure to allow American long-range missiles to be used inside Russian territory. But it's OK for Britain to use the Storm Shadow's long-range missiles.
I think my reading of it at the moment is that we're all left in the dark. We really don't know, for operational security reasons, what that decision is. I just hope it's on the right side. And I don't want to use the word hawkish, but you will get what I mean. We need to be a little bit more robust with what's going on in the Ukraine.
Vladimir Putin sort of threatening World War III. He's done it several times since the Ukraine problem started. How seriously should we take that threat? I mean, should we be scared, or is this all bluster?
Look, when someone is threatening world war as a major power, we should take notice of it. But, you know, it's not going to go from zero to hero with a world war overnight just because there are incursions into Russia. I mean, let's think about what the aim is here for the Ukraine. They want to target command posts, and they want to target munition dumps. That is a very legitimate, within customary law, international law, that is a legitimate target. So I cannot see Putin striking up a world war on the basis of another nation trying to defend itself.
And these weapons that we're talking about, how accurate can they be? I mean, if Zelensky wants to do that, he wants to specifically target, obviously not civilians, specifically target the sort of places you're talking about. How good are these weapons, and how safe would that assumption be?
They're very good. I mean, they have a range of 250 kilometers, about 155 miles. and their accuracy is pinpoint. They're very good. They've got a payload of 450 kilograms. That's going to give you a headache. So I would encourage the stance that our Prime Minister is taking. Very rare that I will ever agree with him on anything, but he is right that we should be pressing to give the Ukrainians whatever they need.
Mike, just one very quick question. We're running out of time, unfortunately. Many viewers are getting in touch saying, we are suffering so much in this country, pensioners, as we already discussed with the winter fuel allowance, etc., etc. We are spending billions on the Ukraine. Is it time to put a stop to it? What would you say to them?
I would like to waken them up. Look, the NHS, schooling, everything else that's competing for budget won't matter in the fullness of time if we're all speaking Russian. If you want peace, you need to prepare for war. I mean, the sad reality is it is expensive. It's an expensive business, but it's worth paying for if you value your freedoms.
OK, we'll leave it there for the moment.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. That's Major Mike Shearer. Yeah.